Hello, welcome to Microfiche Microphone. I'm Micah, and on this channel we look at microfiche from the past, old newspaper articles from long ago, sometimes far away, and we look at them with our modern eyes and try to understand them as best we can. We are looking at an article from the London Magazine in February of 1768, and this article is entitled Opinion of His Majesty's Physicians, etc., on the present practice of inoculation. I'd like to point out that the word inoculation is used instead of vaccination. The reason is the word vaccination wasn't coined until about 30 years after this, when Edward Jenner first started using cowpox to vaccinate people against smallpox. And in this case, it's also about smallpox, but it is not a vaccination. Vacca is the Latin word for cow. So it's actually related to Dr. Jenner's cowpox vaccine. So at this time, they use the word inoculation. And this is also about smallpox. Smallpox, if you're not aware, was a disease that was very rampant at this time in the 18th century, and it had been rampant for centuries. But they had come up with a couple of ways to inoculate people to help them not to get the disease. It's a virus. So I'm not actually 100% sure on what method of inoculation they used, because I don't think they used hypodermic needles back then. So let's take a look at the article. So at the top of the page, it says Observations on the General Practice of Inoculation. So, the opinion of His Majesty's Physicians and Surgeons given January 23, 1768 in regard to Messrs. Suttons, Misters, like that's how they used to say misters. By the way, back then the letter that looks like an F is actually an S. I think you could pick up on that. Misters Suttons practice in inoculation in consequence of a letter from Sir John Pringle dated London, May 6, 1767, to Mr. Brady at Brussels, and another from Count Kaunitz Rittberg, dated Vienna, December 17, 1767, to Count Zeilern, ambassador from the Empress Queen to the King of Great Britain. That's very pompously written, very official. London, January 23, 1768. Okay. The physicians and surgeons of the King of Great Britain, in obedience to His Majesty's commands, transmitted to them by the Earl of Hertford, His Majesty's Lord Chamberlain, have perused and duly considered two letters delivered to them, one from Count Kaunitz to Count Zeilern, dated Vienna, the 7th of December, 1767, the other from Sir John Pringle to Mr. Brady at Brussels, dated London, the 6th of May, 1767. Upon the subject of the inoculation of the smallpox. They humbly beg leave to observe that no report whatever, in respect to the general success of inoculation in this country, can greatly exceed the truth, that for many years past, scarce 1 in 1,000 has failed under the inoculated smallpox, even before the time of the Suttons, where the patients have been properly prepared before, and rightly treated during the eruption, and respect to external heat, diet, cooling, and opening medicines. And opening medicines, whatever that means. So they're claiming that their inoculation is very successful, 99.9% success rate. That would be 1 in 1,000. Sorry, I can't help but be a little bit skeptical, or else there would have been no reason to develop the vaccine that was developed 30 years later by Dr. Jenner. So I'm a little skeptical. I kind of doubt that it was that successful. I'm sure that they had success with it. If you're not aware, smallpox, I was going to say is very deadly, but I believe, according to Wikipedia, it was 30% death rate, which is a lot lower than my mother thought it was. It's not 100%, definitely not. And there were some very famous people who lived through smallpox, including Queen Elizabeth I. So In case you were not aware of that, that's why she wore such thick makeup and she had a very white face, because she was covering up her smallpox scars. However, I think that most people will agree that they hope to never get it. I certainly do. And I'm very, very glad that today we can thank these inoculations that it's no longer around. That by steady observation of these rules and by a much freer use of the open and even cold air than was formerly known in this country, Mr. Sutton and others have communicated the smallpox with very great success. Communicated, okay? I'm not sure why they use that word. They have communicated the smallpox with very great success, and have thrown some new lights upon the subject of inoculation, particularly with respect to the exposing of patients to the open air, that the inoculators in England in general have adopted this method, and experience the success of it daily. Okay, well, there's some scientific backing to that, because if you are in a room full of sick people, one way to keep it from spreading quite as quickly is to allow fresh air to come in and keep it from stagnating. Because if you're coughing, for example, and the person in the bed next to you could very well get that coughing close enough to them, all those little lung particles, and then they could catch whatever you have. But if you keep air moving and keep fresh air coming in, then as soon as you cough, it will get swept away and dispersed enough that it probably won't get anyone else sick. So, I mean, there is some scientific backing for that. That's one of the things that during the corona pandemic, they were saying open the windows at the schools, for example. I think they said every 20 minutes or in my area. So every 20 minutes, they'd open the windows for 2 to 5 minutes and let the air circulate, and that was helping to stop the spread. I mean, I'm not sure how successful that was, but that was definitely one of the things that they did to try and stop the spread. So I could see why, the fresh air was a good thing. That they are of opinion that the great success of Mr. Sutton is to be attributed to the advantages airing from the exposition to colder air, from a judicious treatment, and the due observance of some other rules which have usually been followed in this country before, and not to any particular nostrum or specific remedy. Nostrum, huh? So another reason why it needed to be cold air is perhaps that kept their fevers down. So if you had a high fever and at this point they didn't really have a reliable way to sink that fever except for cooling the body. So that could also be another reason they used the cold air. Just in a thought. That they have no doubt but that the method of inoculation practiced in England with such universal success would be as successful at Vienna, provided the inoculation was performed with the same skill and prudence, and the patients were equally submissive to the rules directed. Yeah, follow your rules, listen to your doctors, people. In answer to the extract from Sir John Pringle's letter, they beg leave to make the following observations. It is said that the number of pustules on the whole body of a patient inoculated by Sutton does not exceed 100 or 200 at most, commonly not a dozen. If it is meant that the number of pustules can be determined, and they will never exceed 200, they beg leave to observe that this is not an exact representation of the case. For though it will very frequently happen that the number of pustules will not be more than a dozen, yet sometimes, though very rarely, they will greatly exceed 200. Yeah, that's if you get full-blown smallpox, right? So I'm taking it that they're infecting people on purpose, is what it sounds like, but in a way and under a controlled manner that the cases are usually mild and can easily be handled and leave very few scars. That's what it sounds like to me. I'll Google it right after I'm finished reading this article, unless they explain it. So, explain their methods. It is said that Sutton does not require his patients to keep indoors. This passage seems to imply that it is at the option of the patients whether they will go out or not. But the truth is, they are strictly enjoined to go abroad, and to expose themselves to the open air. So they take them on walks, I guess? They're like, nope, you have to go, come on, go outside. It is said that Sutton has inoculated 40,000 patients without losing one. They are not able to ascertain the number that he has inoculated, but believe he has not always been successful, though he has failed so very seldom that they do not think that it ought to be considered as any objection to his method. Yeah, okay, so, yeah, he's saying that it's, even if it's not 100% true, it sounds like it's a very reliable way. So, it's not a bad method, it's just that maybe there are better ones. Just saying. Sir John Pringle adds that when Sutton is called to people in the natural smallpox who are in danger, and at the height or crisis of the distemper, the first thing he does to relieve them is to expose them to the open air, to carry them into it if it be possible, and this even in the winter, and if they are not in a condition to be removed, he orders all the windows and bed curtains to be thrown open. They apprehend this practice has been found unsuccessful. Well, that's too bad. So apparently it doesn't help if you have full-blown smallpox. Too bad. So I was thinking that it would lower your fever and possibly help you to survive it. But unfortunately it doesn't sound like it's been very successful. That's too bad. The Suttons are undoubtedly in some respects improvers of the art of inoculation, but by applying their rules too generally, and by not making improper allowance for the difference of the constitutions, have frequently done harm. Ooh, that's not good. So they're saying if somebody is very sick, that their methods are not very effective, because the person has to be in fairly good health in order for it to actually help them. All their improvements have been adopted by other inoculators, and in the hands of these, the art seems to be have carried to very great perfection. Signed, William Duncan. What is CL short for? CL? Claude? Maybe? I don't know. I'm just guessing. Winteringham, R. Warren, J. Ranby, C. Hawkins, D. Middleton. WM is William. CL? I don't know. Physicians to the king and surgeons to the king. Well, as they have a good fancy title and service to the king doesn't necessarily mean that they are better doctors than others, and they just usually have a better bedside manner. So let's look at the Wikipedia article on smallpox, and let's see what we can find. Smallpox was an infectious disease caused by one of two virus variants, variola major and variola minor. The agent of variola virus belongs to the genus blah blah blah. The last naturally occurring case was diagnosed in October 1977. So it's been officially eradicated since 1980. Yay! The risk of death after contracting the disease was about 30%, with higher rates among babies. Often those who survived had extensive scarring of their skin, and some were left blind. So it had a lot of really bad side effects. The initial symptoms of the disease included fever and vomiting. This was followed by formation of ulcers in the mouth and a skin rash. Over a number of days, the skin rash turned into characteristic fluid-filled blisters with a dent in the center. The bumps then scabbed over and fell off, leaving scars. The disease was spread between people or via contaminated objects. Prevention was achieved mainly through the smallpox vaccine. Once the disease had developed, certain antiviral medications may have helped. Okay. The origin is unknown. However, the earliest evidence of the disease dates to the 3rd century BC in Egyptian mummies. Wow. Okay, yeah, that's a long time ago. Oh my goodness. The disease historically occurred in outbreaks. In 18th century Europe, that's this time I was reading, it is estimated that 400,000 people died of the disease per year. Holy cow, no wonder they were working so hard against it. And that 1/3 of all cases of blindness were due to smallpox. Wow. Smallpox is estimated to have killed up to 300 million people in the 20th century, and we are in the 18th century where it was much more rampant, and around 500 million people in the last 100 years of its existence. Earlier deaths include 6 monarchs. As recently as 1967, 15 million cases occurred a year. That's crazy. So inoculation for smallpox appears to have started in China around the 1500s. Europe adopted this practice from Asia in the first half of the 18th century. So this inoculation was actually a fairly relatively recent thing. So the rest of that article is about after the time we're looking at. So I'm going to skip down to the history. Signs and symptoms. I'm not going to look at all of these because I don't think it's super important to what we're doing. What I'm interested in is the inoculation. Disease emergence. Eradication. So the first clear reference to a smallpox inoculation was made by the Chinese author Wan Quan. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, so feel free to correct me. In his, it's Chinese. Sorry, I don't read Chinese, so I'm not going to even try. Published in 1549. His book that I can't read the title of, with earliest hints of the practice in China during the 10th century. In China, powdered smallpox scabs were blown up the nose of the healthy. So they would take pieces of the scabs from the people who had full-blown smallpox, grind it up, and then blow it up your nose. And that was their first inoculation. People would then develop a mild case of the disease, and from then on were immune to it. The technique did have a 0.5 to 2% mortality rate, but that was considerably less than the 20 to 30% mortality rate of the disease itself. Yeah, I'll give you that one. 2 reports of the Chinese practice of inoculation were received by the Royal Society of London in 1700. One by Dr. Martin Lister, who received a report by an employee of the East India Company, and another by Clopton Havers. Voltaire reports that the Chinese had practiced smallpox inoculation these 100 years. Variolation has been witnessed in Turkey by Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who later introduced it in the UK. So this reference now to the inoculation that's exactly what it's about. They must have started doing this technique that the Chinese had used by taking ground up scabs of sores. Oh, that sounds so gross, doesn't it? And then they would blow it up the nose of people, and then they would have a mild case. And as long as, according to these doctors, as long as they were taken outside and given fresh air constantly, then they tended to be very fine. They tended to be fine and have no lasting effects. So, okay, yeah, I can see that. That makes sense to me. I'm really glad they came up with that. They probably saved a lot of lives. Even though it turned out that Edward Jenner's cowpox vaccine was more effective. However, this one worked for a couple of centuries, so my hat's off to you, Dr. what was his name again? Wan Quan. So, very good. I'm so glad that you did your work. I'm sure a lot of people appreciated that. I thought that this article also gives us a perspective in our condition today, where some people are very reluctant to get the vaccine for the coronavirus. And I think that if we look back at this time, even though it's not 100% effective, like this one had a 2% mortality rate still, people were still willing to do it because that meant that they wouldn't get the full-blown smallpox. And like thinking of this time, I can't imagine saying, no, I would rather not have the vaccine, or in this case the inoculation, because I am too afraid of it. They just said it was extremely successful. I feel like it's almost a slap in the face to these people who worked so hard to eradicate diseases that were rampant at the time, to look back at our lives today and realize that all we need is a little vaccine that is tested and tested and tested and tested before it's given to us, and you're not going to die from it. So that's my rant for the day. Please get your corona vaccines. I would really love for this pandemic to be over, and I think that most everybody would as well. We're not doing it because people are telling us to. We're doing it to stop the spread of a disease so that it doesn't become so deadly that we have this high mortality rate. At the moment, the coronavirus mortality rate is fairly low. But what if it were something more serious? What if it were the next Black Death, which had, 75% mortality or plus, more than that? Or even smallpox, 30%. That's quite high. Think of how many of your loved ones you'd be losing. So I think that this is something we need to remember, our own privilege today, that we are very privileged and we are in this position of privilege that we can say, yes, I will take this vaccine in order to stop the spread of a disease, because I personally don't want it either. All right, moral rant over. Thank you for joining us on our Microfiche microphone. Once again, I'm Micah. Feel free to like and subscribe down below, and I hope to see you in the next video.